Welcome back to Dentro la Storia, the channel for those who love contemporary history. This April, Giovanni and I have planned a mini-series, a few episodes entirely dedicated to the War of Liberation, and of course, to April 25th, 1945. This month, we will celebrate the 81st anniversary of the Liberation, but we will do so by exploring various topics that lead us toward the liberation itself, also asking ourselves some necessary questions. Questions about the Salerno turning point, about the pact made between the various parties, with the aim of ending the war and then rebuilding the country. Questions about what is called the Civil War, which perhaps was not really a civil war. Questions about the actual strength of the Italian Social Republic. Questions about possible scenarios, for example, Ukraine, about what would have happened to fascism without the war. And starting right with today's video, questions about the figure of Benito Mussolini during his last year of life. Within the Italian Social Republic, within a rapidly deteriorating war situation, within a situation that was increasingly slipping out of the control of the dictator from Forlì. Today we are starting this little mini-series that we hope you will enjoy, dedicated to the final stages of World War II in Italy.
Troverete delle offerte.
In the description we read, "The last year of Benito Mussolini's life represents one of the most dramatic and complex moments in contemporary Italian history. From 1944 to April 1945, the political trajectory of the fascist dictator came to its conclusion. In a context marked by the gradual military collapse of his last political entity, the Italian Social Republic, by the increasing intensity of the War of Liberation in the peninsula, by the decisive advance of the Allies toward northern Italy, and by partisan activity. In this final phase, Mussolini's power appears profoundly transformed compared to the dictatorship he had established between 1925 and 1943. If during the regime the Deuce had exercised almost total control over the Italian political and, of course, social system, in the context of the RSI, his authority is strongly limited by the military and political presence of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. Historiography has long debated the nature of this phase, but we'll cover the true nature of the RSI in another video later this month. The last year of Mussolini's life must still be analyzed as the result of internment. Among various factors, the progressive deterioration of the military situation, the increasing dependence on Nazi Germany, the ideological radicalization of Republican fascism, and the growing pressure from the resistance movement. At the beginning of 1944, the Italian Social Republic was formally a sovereign state, but in the political and military reality, it was strongly influenced by the German authorities. Mussolini had initially considered the Rocca delle Camminate in the province of Forlì, a territory he knew very well, as the seat of his new government. But the German military authorities considered the Rocca delle Camminate unsafe, so they had suggested quite insistently a move to Lake Garda, specifically to Gargnano, near Salò. The choice of this location, relatively protected and especially close to the German command centers, reflects the precariousness of Mussolini's political and military situation and that of his inner circle. Contemporary accounts describe Mussolini as profoundly changed compared to the charismatic leader of the regime years. His age, the difficulties of the war, and the awareness of dependence on Nazi Germany all contribute to transforming his political style. Many officials of the RSI notice an increasingly disillusioned and almost fatalistic attitude. Mussolini often appears isolated, surrounded by trusted collaborators who lack any real strategic influence. They are almost yes-men who try to flatter him, to prod him, but nothing more. According to several historians, during that period, the Duce oscillates between two contrasting attitudes. On one hand, he tries to revive the ideological identity of Republican fascism, promoting a revolutionary and social rhetoric. On the other hand, he shows a growing awareness of the impossibility of reversing the course of the war. In this context, the attempt to relaunch fascism takes shape through a more radical political program. The Verona Congress of November 1943 had proclaimed the birth of a republican and social fascism, an antithesis compared to the previous experience of symbiosis with the Royal House of Savoy. This new form promised the socialization of businesses and a cooperative transformation of the economy. However, during 1944, such projects remained largely unfulfilled. The opposition from industrialists, administrative difficulties, and especially the military situation prevented the concrete implementation of the announced reforms. 1944 also marks a phase of increasing intensity in the War of Liberation in northern Italy. The resistance movement, coordinated by the CLN, the National Liberation Committee for Northern Italy, progressively expands its military and political activities. The partisan formations operate mainly in the mountainous and rural areas, and during the year they also manage to organize clandestine networks in the cities of the north. GAP, the partisan action groups, are formed and operate mainly in cities, starting with small and medium ones before moving to larger ones. Acts of sabotage against military infrastructure, but also against industrial facilities controlled by the Germans, become increasingly frequent. The response of the RSI and the German authorities is extremely harsh. The operations to suppress the partisans involve entire local communities, roundups, deportations, shootings, and hangings. All this only serves to further exacerbate the climate of civil conflict within rural communities and urban neighborhoods throughout the RSI area. The Ardeatine massacre in Rome in March 1944 is emblematic. Although the reprisal was organized by the German military authorities, the cooperation of elements within the RSI helps reinforce in the public mind the association between Republican fascism and the violence of the Nazi occupation. Against this backdrop, the evolving relationship between Mussolini and Hitler also comes into play. At the beginning, so we're talking about the early 1930s, the relationship between the two is one of distrust, even conflict. Let's think about the death of Engelbert Dollfuss, which we've already talked about. You can find the video on the channel. As time went by, the relationship evolved. It became a solid friendship within a strategic alliance. That relationship of formal equality, established between 1936 and 1940, gradually began to crack. First with Mussolini's decision to attack Greece, launching a so-called parallel war, almost as if to distance himself from the German allies' military initiatives. Then it became a relationship of necessity, due to the German support needed to avoid further setbacks in Greece, Albania, and North Africa. Mussolini has been completely dependent on German political and military support since October 1943 without the protection of the Reich. The Social Republic could not survive. And yet for a few weeks, the talks between Mussolini and Hitler in 1944 clearly show this new dynamic. The Deuce sometimes tries to gain greater autonomy, but strategic decisions remain firmly in the hands of the German command. Even on July 20th, 1944, the day of Operation Valkyrie, which we've already talked about, you can find the video on the channel, Mussolini had a meeting scheduled with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg. Mussolini's train arrives in the early afternoon, shortly after the explosion inside the Lagerbaracke. Mussolini is taken inside the rooms, devastated by the explosion, sees what happened, and talks with Hitler, who has just had his arm treated after being injured in the explosion. But even on that occasion, Mussolini plays the part of the weak man, the beggar, the man who has come to the master's castle to ask for help, to ask for something in return. The personal relationship between Mussolini and Hitler remains good. Hitler, for example, pretends not to listen to the complaints of his generals and even some Nazi officials regarding the Italian ally, who is considered increasingly weak and therefore expendable. Until the very end, Hitler continues to consider Mussolini a historic ally, as well as a symbol of European fascism. For this reason, he keeps helping him. On the other hand, Mussolini sees the Führer as the only possible guarantor of his regime's survival. It is no longer an equal relationship. It is only so on a personal level as a friendship, but not on a political or military level. The balance of power is very clear. In the last year of the war, this relationship is one of the key elements for understanding the political nature of the Mussolini regime. If in previous years the alliance between Italy and Germany had developed within a consolidated relationship, even with the imbalances we have already described, in the context of the RSI, between the two leaders, a deeply intense dynamic develops. On the military level, the main operational decisions on the Italian front are made by the German command, which has entrusted them to Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. The RSI armies, reconstituted after September 8, essentially carry out auxiliary tasks or actions against the partisans. They are extremely limited military forces in both quantity and quality, but we will talk more about them in the video we will dedicate specifically to the RSI in a few days. The personal relationship between Mussolini and Hitler maintains a strong symbolic component until the end. The testimonies of Mussolini's collaborators suggest that the dictator from Forlì had ambivalent feelings toward the Führer. On one hand, he remained tied to him by a political and ideological bond. On the other, he sometimes showed frustration with the subordinate role he was now forced to play. The relationship between the two leaders in the final months of the conflict is characterized by Mussolini's progressive political marginalization, as he finds himself leading a state without real independence. As the weeks and months go by, Mussolini becomes more and more disillusioned. A key episode in all this takes place on December 16, 1944. At the Teatro Lirico in Milan, Mussolini's last public speech is scheduled. This speech represents the last major public appearance of the Duce and marks a crucial moment in the story we're telling you today. The context in which the speech takes place is extremely difficult for the Republican regime. During 1944, the military situation of Germany and its allies progressively worsened. The Western allies have liberated Rome, landed in Normandy, landed in Provence, and are moving up through Europe, gradually liberating it. In the east, the Red Army is pushing harder and harder, has recaptured all of its territory, and has begun to penetrate the Carpathians. And it's heading toward the heart of Poland, after already liberating Warsaw. At the same time, the partisan resistance in northern Italy is intensifying. Strikes, sabotage, and armed actions are making territorial control by the fascists increasingly precarious. In this context, the speech at the Teatro Lirico serves a dual purpose: to strengthen the morale of the supporters of Republican fascism and to reaffirm the political legitimacy of the regime. The audience at the Teatro Lirico is made up of fascist militants, officials, and representatives of Republican organizations. You could almost call it a claque. Mussolini delivers a very long, structured speech, a speech that combines elements of propaganda, political analysis, and ideological mobilization. In this regard, one of the central themes of Mussolini's speech is the portrayal of the war as a total conflict. In his speech, Mussolini describes the ongoing clash as a struggle between two opposing visions of European civilization. On one side, fascism and National Socialism. On the other, the Western democracies described as perpetually decadent and the barbarism of Soviet communism. Within this interpretation, Mussolini tries to present the RSI as the last defense of Europe against what he called the Bolshevik threat. Another important element of the speech is the attempt to relaunch the social project. Republican project. Mussolini reiterates the intention to implement the socialization of enterprises, a project that was supposed to transform the Italian economic structure and overcome traditional capitalism. As we mentioned earlier, this topic had already been at the center of the political program, developed at the Verona Congress in 1943. Up until that moment, there had been no concrete application. The resistance of the industrialists had played its part. And yet in his speech in December 1943, Mussolini insists again. Why? Maybe because it's one of the few topics left on the table? Maybe because he's seeking total confrontation with industry? Maybe because he wants to urge his followers to take direct control of the Italian economy, or what's left of it? These are questions that are hard to answer. But from a rhetorical point of view, Mussolini's speech shows some characteristic traits of his oratory style. The use of very strong imagery, the call for active mobilization, the depiction of war as a decisive element in national history. However, many contemporary observers also notice a significant change. Unlike the old speeches, those from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia, or those at the massive rallies, the tone of Mussolini's speech appears less triumphant, more marked by an awareness of military and political difficulties. Around him on the stage are the party leaders. Some of them keep their gaze straight ahead. Someone else reveals through their facial expressions a lack of confidence in the future. The speech at the Opera House is often interpreted as the last, practically desperate attempt at a political revival of Republican fascism. In a world that is falling apart, Mussolini attempts a dramatic move, but probably even he is aware of the fact that we are heading toward the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, the end of Nazi-fascist totalitarianism in Europe. Despite the propagandistic emphasis of that event, the real impact of the speech is limited. In the following weeks, the military situation will continue to deteriorate, and the regime's ability to mobilize the population will decrease more and more. The attempt to call up the draft classes, first with persuasion and then with force, will be a real own goal. Not to mention the lack of ideological influence on the Italians, who are increasingly disillusioned, increasingly disenchanted, increasingly angry, and more determined to bring the war to an end. By now, we are nearing the end. The last months of Mussolini will also be the last months of the Italian Social Republic, the last months of the war, but we will tell that story in another video, which of course we will publish this month. We still have a final assessment to make about the last year of Benito Mussolini's life, an assessment that represents a crucial phase, whether we like it or not. In our country's history, at least in the 20th century, between 1944 and the beginning of 45, the dictator from Romagna found himself leading a fragile state, militarily subordinate to Nazi Germany. All this while the war is increasingly coming to an end, and while his relationship with Adolf Hitler is changing radically. The desperate attempt to revive fascism in a Republican form, first with the Congress of Verona, then with the speech at the Milan Opera House, had no effect. The rapid collapse of the regime is the final stage of an inevitable phase. Fascism does not end in December 1944. It will still have a few more months of life and then be revived after the war by other political groups, more or less openly. But we will talk about the last phase of Benito Mussolini, his escape from Milan to Switzerland, and what happened in another video. So don't miss the next episodes of our mini-series dedicated to Mussolini and Salò. And we'll talk to you soon with more content here on Dentro la Storia.